Our next speaker gave us a few anxious moments because of the traffic situation, but fortunately for us, she did not continue in the stream onto the Wall Street ticker parade, but in fact did come to join us at the Hyatt. She has an even more direct connection to St. Peter's, and it's a pleasure to introduce one of our alum, a star alum, to the Business Symposium. Kathy Fitzgerald graduated from St. Peter's in 1971 with a degree in English. She was a debater with the Gannon debate team as a student and went on to earn her master's in broadcast journalism at Boston College. You see a little theme going here, broadcast journalism? Through the years, Kathy's been dedicated to her alma mater, not only through her philanthropy, but through her volunteer time and effort and good heart. She's a former trustee, a former regent, or a regent now, and received the Distinguished Alumni Award for Professional Achievement in 1998. She's currently Global Head of Communications and Chief Communications Officer for KPMG. A little bit of a mouthful for me. As such, she's responsible for leading internal and external communications for KPMG in the United States and for KPMG International. Prior to joining them in 2006, she served as Senior Vice President of Public Relations and Advertising for Lucent. She's been named one of the Power 10 Marketeers by Business Marketing newspaper, and further cementing her ties to St. Peter's, she's married to Michael Coca from the class of '60. So please welcome one of our own, Kathleen Fitzgerald.
Thank you very much. As I said, I'm the token St. Peter's graduate and proud of it. Actually, the last time I spoke here at the Business Symposium was 10 years ago, so I'm kind of like Brigadoon. I rise every 10 years to talk about something from a business perspective. It's funny, I have PowerPoints in sharp contrast. What a tough act to follow with Byron Pitts. What a wonderful job. And I'm realizing that now that I work at an accounting firm, I think Bill Corzine, who's in the audience, both a St. Peter's alumni and a KPMG alumni, will understand, suddenly you become incapable of having a conversation without some form of PowerPoint behind you. And I will tell you, in the spirit of only in America and progress, when I started my career at Western Electric 2,000 years ago, I used to be the person who pushed, at that point it was like slide projectors, and actually a gentleman who works for me, Steve Yanis, who is also a St. Peter's College alumni, who works for me at KPMG, is here to do this. So only in America can you kind of keep this progress, and someday Steve will be at this podium with somebody hopefully from St. Peter's and KPMG pushing his view graphs. So I introduce Steve in that context. Yay, Steve. I will say Steve is actually among a dozen St. Peter's alumni I have hired and worked with over the years, and it's always a wonderful experience. Today's Business Symposium is especially exciting, the topic, because it's restoring confidence, restoring trust. You should know that in the last 3 weeks, I have written 5 speeches for the global chairman of KPMG, because he's been at seminars, and guess what the topic has been? Restoring trust and building confidence. And he gave these talks customized in Dublin, Shanghai, Dubai, and Barcelona. So I'm going to give my talk in several languages if you just want to hang on, because I'm really, really ready. And, you know, I will tell you, I'm kind of excited to be here on a number of levels, because I'm kind of hoping that Ali Veshy will tell me what to do with my 401k, as I'm sure the rest of you are all waiting to hear. But basically, I've had the opportunity, and you know, what qualifies a communications person to speak in such august company? And one of it is I've had the opportunity, and some people might put the opportunity in quotes, to be the head of a communications organization for 2 very large and very different organizations at the times of the last 2 economic crises. As Pat told you, by the way, 10 years ago, Pat also introduced me, so there was a lot of symmetry in my life. It's always very consistent. I'm Chief Communications Officer for KPMG, and as auditors, we sign off on the financial statements of many of the leading public companies. In fact, basically take the Fortune 500, we serve 72% of them in some form or another as their auditor, their tax advisor, their consultant. So just by definition, we're in the middle of the action. Our clients feel the heat, we feel the heat. We're right there next to them feeling it. In fact, actually, in the course of the last year, we have done the work with 4 of the largest banks to help them convert from investment banks to bank holding companies, which is, you know, kind of a huge trend that's occurred in the banking industry as a result of the credit crisis. And of course, we advise companies on risk management. We did a survey last summer and discovered that 9 out of 10 financial services executives are saying that they were in the process of strengthening their risk management plans. Good thing, huh? But I mean, that's where the focus is. And of course, for a company like ours, or a firm like ours, when there is regulation, and there will be more regulation, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, that is the kind of work that we get involved in, and we're in the middle of it. I should talk a little bit about 10 years ago when I was here, I will say in 1999, Lucent Technologies at that point was the most widely held stock in America. We had created the brand. It was an exciting time, and we were in the middle of a technology bubble. That changed, as everybody might remember, when the tech wreck came. And the funny thing is, there was the tech wreck when people had kind of been saturated through technology. And, you know, for a company like Lucent, what we were affected by were all the small telephone companies that had built up, had money, easy money to get to start businesses, and they were starting to fail. And as they started to fail, we had less people to sell our equipment to. And we could start to feel it. In that same year, kind of unrelated, but it had an impact, was Enron and WorldCom, which were genuine, complete accounting scandals. And, you know, reflecting on the experience of going through that, the first thing I'd say is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. But the second thing is I find it teaches you important lessons that help prepare you to handle these challenges. And a lot of the lessons that I learned during that crisis, I certainly have translated into what we're doing both for KPMG and our clients during this crisis. But the tech wreck and the financial crisis were very, very different. Very different crises, but there were also important similarities. Both were preceded by moments of irrational exuberance, as to quote Alan Greenspan, who's looking less and less like someone to quote, but to quote him anyway. And in the tech bubble, investors pumped up the price of tech stocks based on business plans that didn't really have much substance, but had a lot of hope. I mean, people, to this day, it's only really Google that's making a lot of money on the internet as an internet company. You have some other ancillary things, and a lot of businesses use the internet very effectively for business, so some of the promise did come. It just came 10 years later. But at the time, the price was going up and up and up. People totally believed, and I'll actually tell you, the pressures that were on in a company like Lucent, our salespeople were coming in saying, people aren't buying, the market isn't there. And at the time, the CEO of Lucent said, how can Nortel, our biggest competitor, how come they're doing this? Why are they showing 30% growth and you're down at 8% growth? You must be doing something wrong. Well, the reality is our salespeople were right. We could, because we were the largest, we could see it first. But the stock analyst couldn't see it, so they truly penalized us when we were kind of saying, it has to be coming. We're the ones who sell to the most of them. And those Nortel executives who were posting those terrific earnings and taking huge bonuses in January, 6 weeks later in March, posted a warning that said basically what we were saying is, we're not seeing the market. We're just not seeing it. And actually, I can remember saying to a Wall Street Journal reporter at the time, and I used to also kid, at the Wall Street Journal, I had the young reporter who had just come out of UPenn and worked an internship at Business Week. And he was all full of pep and he was investigating. Nortel had the reporter up in Canada who was a married man with 5 children. And I said, why do I get you and they get him? Why is this happening to me? And we'd laugh. We've become very good friends, and actually he's a good reporter in the C section of the Wall Street Journal. When I met him, he was a 25-year-old snippy guy who was the bane of my existence, totally the bane of my existence. And I said to him at the time, you got to know that you look at Nortel, that's where the issue is. They're reporting this incorrectly. You've got to watch them. Well, 2 years later, when all of those executives were pulled in for fraud, absolute positive fraud, I emailed Dennis. I'm out of Lucent at this point, but I emailed Dennis with a copy to say, look, did you see this? Did you see I was right? And he wrote back to me, I'm going to say the 3 words that every woman wants to most hear. You were right. And that was a true statement. But, okay, so there's that exuberance there, and you kind of see how people got to, I gotta report something better because it must be going on. Then you have housing. And here's a funny story. I was working on an investor education project, and Robert Shiller is the person who wrote the book, the first book that there's going to be a tech wreck. And he wrote it the year before there was a tech wreck, and people said he's a genius. He's a Yale professor. He is also the author of the Case-Shiller Index, which is how you measure housing. In 2004, I end up at a lunch sitting next to him, totally inappropriately, but he's a totally charming, lovely man. And he started to talk about how his book was coming out and that housing was irrational. I said, it can't be. He said, people don't make money on housing. I said, look, I bought a $75,000 house in Brooklyn. It was 17 feet wide. And 4 years later, I sold it for $175,000. I made money on my houses. You have to be wrong. And then I took it into Milburn and took the $175,000 in, and 12 years later sold it for $350,000. I said, this is a money-making event. And he said, no, 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 not in the macro sense. Long term, this is all going to crash, blah, 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 blah. This was 2004. His book comes out. He got, everybody buys a Shiller book if you're really an economist, but it wasn't with exuberance because the market didn't fall to 2007. And he was another man. I saw him in 2006. I said, housing market still hasn't fallen. He said, it's gonna. I swear it's gonna. So he was 3 years off, but he was right in a macro sense, which is kind of a lesson one way or the other. Another voice in the wilderness was an economist and a professor named Nouriel Roubini, right across the river in NYU. And he has been warning about the real estate bubble for years, along with Shiller, but more adamantly. He said it would burst, and a recession would hit our economy hard, and no one took him seriously. In fact, he was the contrarian on cable news networks. He was given a cartoonish name, Dr. Doom. But he was right, and he's no cartoon. And actually, yesterday he spoke on a panel with the chairman of KPMG in Dublin, and I just want you to know he's not seeing things getting a lot better. He's seeing a little bit of a recovery, but he thinks it's longer and that people shouldn't be as pumped up about the stock market. And now, of course, everybody is really listening to him. And what do you learn? There's an interesting interview in Newsweek this week with William Powers, and he was the special investigator who looked at what happened at Enron. And 2 key lessons he learned. 1, the good times do end. And 2, surround yourself with people who are competent, honest, and don't take shortcuts. And I think these are words to live by for any business. The financial crisis we've experienced, and we're still going through, is more profound and more systemic than the Enron scandal. It's a very different thing. Every player in the capital markets, the way I kind of phrase it a lot of times, no one's to blame and everyone's to blame. Nobody did anything illegal except for Bernie Madoff, and he was a very small part of really what happened. But the system didn't step up and provide the checks and balances along the way that might have prevented or at least softened what happened. What happened last year was not the result of an international fraud. There was nothing illegal being done. Even Obama on one of the radio stations said that's the scary part. What people did wasn't illegal. But we saw a herd mentality. Warren Buffett has always said the 5 most dangerous words in business are, everyone else is doing it. And in the case of creating and using complex financial instruments, there was a lot of that going on. I mean, if you go back and look at it, you'd say, Why would you think it was okay to give loans to people who didn't have enough money, almost beg them to have the money, and then take those loans and package them into an offering that people would buy stock on because you figure you're leveraging the risk away from your system? How could that be right? And I actually kind of liken it back to my Lucent days when the CEO was saying, how can you not have growth when Nortel has 30% growth? Everybody else has growth. Why don't you? What are you doing? And creating a pressured environment. Same thing happened in the financial. In fact, actually, there's a story about in Fannie Mae. The Fannie Mae executive, his analyst said to him, you can't give these loans. These loans don't work. And in fact, Congress called him in and said, look, Wall Street is making 25% returns on packaging these loans. You go out and give these loans. Everybody's doing it. And that's kind of what happened. And when our clients look at the financial crisis and its effects on the global economic system, they come away with two lessons. And we're out talking to them all the time, and Tim Flynn is out talking to them all the time. And the first is we all have to go back to a fundamental way of doing business, calculating the risk and returns on every decision. You've got to risk management's front and center. It is on the minds of every board member, not only management, but every board member saying, where's your risk management plan? Now, I'm not saying no one can take risk. Without risk, there is not reward. But too much risk, actually, I kind of like this. In preparing for one of the talks, I talked to the British head, the UK head of financial services, who said, now, Kathy, you really need to know there's a difference between banks and casino banks. We need different regulations for casino banks. And so when I tried to convince Tim Flynn to say this in his speech, he would never be this pejorative about his clients. But so I thought I'd use the line here. Did you like it? Casino banks, you know, it's good. I'd be very frustrated if that line wasn't used in a public forum. But I think, essentially when I say we're going to go back to basis, the sad thing is the most innovation in this country in the last 5 years has been in creating financial products, except for Steve Jobs. God bless Steve Jobs. He is innovating in technology. If we took all the energy and all the brilliance of the people who went into investment banking in the last 10 years and put it against creating products and services that made people's lives better, if they had gone into medicine, if they had gone into how can we help feed the hungry, if they had engineered different ways to do social services, if they took that financial acumen and looked at Social Security, how much better off would we all be? I think it's an encouraging thing. In the last graduating class of Yale, instead of 70% going into investment banking, the number went down to 40%. It's become a less attractive profession because I think people are returning to the basics, the absolute basics, and that's going to be a change in the country. No one's going to be saying to their son or daughter, go make a lot of money in investment banking. If it's something that you're very interested in, you could use it for good purposes, yes, but it's not. They're not going to be the John Bon Jovi of professions anymore because of what happened. The second lesson that I think all of our clients have taken is trust. Trust is critical to making the capital markets grow. Our financial system is built on trust and confidence. Our financial system fell apart when banks stopped trusting each other. Bear Stearns went out of business because people didn't trust that if they got the money, they'd do the right thing. Trust is at the heart of any relationship, whether it's business or personal. And it was the lack of trust that caused the markets to freeze up. Investors aren't going to invest until they trust the capital market system. Consumers won't buy until they're confident that they're going to have jobs and that they can get credit. And businesses won't deal with each other, lend money, or make deals until they have trust in the system. So nothing gets going until we build in trust. Edelman Public Relations has a trust barometer. In fact, if there's a God, see, look at how good he is. It is on the screen. Are we proud of him? Yay, St. Peter's. Okay, we're proud. They have a trust barometer. And the reality is, in January of this year, do you trust business to do the right thing? Only 36% of people answered, yes, I do. It is a lower rating than politicians. And when we go out and we talk to our clients, we say, your rating is now lower than a politician. What are you going to do? And no one's going to do business with you. It's good business to be trustworthy, and the only way you be trustworthy is to be honest and to show people why they should have confidence. The difference is in China, actually, where the economy is really doing well, and they have actually responded pretty well, their trust levels are significantly higher. 78% of Chinese people trust business to do the right thing. So business right now has a huge incentive to get people to trust. So how do you restore trust? The first thing you do is you have greater transparency, and that's where people like KPMG come in. I'll also just tell you one little lesson on auditors. Auditors don't run businesses. Auditors don't get to tell the guy, you're giving loans to who? Our job is to make sure he reports out everything about his business that is relevant for an investor to know. And we did that, quite frankly. And remember, nothing illegal happened. We were reporting it. But now, transparency also means you don't have a financial instrument that essentially only an economist at Yale or Nouriel Roubini could understand. You have to have a financial instrument, any of us can understand. Transparency is like sunlight. It's the most effective disinfectant for bringing greater clarity to the markets. In fact, what we're saying is you almost need a radical transparency with enough information about your operations to give every investor the information they need to make an informed decision. The other thing that's going to restore trust is regulation. Nobody loves regulation. We should all love regulation right now. Effective regulation is important to restoring trust. Now, some argue that business has a natural inclination to act in its own self-interest, making regulation largely unnecessary. But we've learned this isn't the case. In the last 4 years, we had a free market that did not self-correct. So basically, when business were looking at investments with 20-to-1 and 30-to-1 leverage, things have gotten out of control. So the right regulatory structures must be put in place. Now, I'm not talking as an Obama Democrat, which I am, by the way, but I'm not talking that way. I'm actually talking in terms of global systemic regulation that cover complex and troublesome financial products. We're talking about basically regulating every part of the system, which includes broker-dealers. That'd be the Bernie Madoff. We're looking for a global solution where basically you essentially have to report out even in your, there's 2 bills in front of Congress and there's 2 bills in front of the G20 that basically say in everybody's proxy you have to report out on who's measuring risk. Is your board measuring risk? How are you doing it? So everything is out in the open. If you could trust the whole systems that support, then you're going to start to invest. You're going to say, hey, I believe that they're watching. And basically what we're telling our clients is you have to get ahead of regulation. You have to basically put together, figure out what regulators are worried about, and show them how you can deal with it. And in the main, it is transparency. You got to get ahead of it and then cooperate with the regulators and help be part of forming the regulations, because it's in all of our benefits for people to feel that they can trust. But you know what? All the regulations in the world aren't going to work. You have to get back to basics. You have to get back to a lot of the things I'd like to think we all learned at St. Peter's College. The culture must be reinforced with individual ethics and integrity programs. At KPMG, actually, I say this, and we say this to all of our clients, and I'll move a little faster because I'm sure that I'm getting past my time. But essentially, we've created what we wanted was a model ethics and integrity program. 4 years ago, KPMG, basically, we almost lost our firm. We had an issue with tax shelters, and one of the things we said when we settled with the government was we would put in place a model ethics and integrity program. Actually, in every one of your tables, there's a story in Ethisphere, which is a magazine for ethical business, where we basically talked about our program and what we do to assure that every single one of our people act with the highest level of ethics and integrity. And we basically, to succeed, an ethics and compliance program has to be more than rules and policies. It has to embed an ethical culture into the organization. Think about your organization, or think about yourselves as business people. When is the last time you had a conversation with someone you hired or someone you work with about ethics? This is important. One of the things we do, every single person we hire, they take an interactive training class online with people acting out if this happens. And it starts out with things like, okay, you basically worked till 9 o'clock 4 nights a week, and company policy says after 8 you can take a car home, and you didn't do it. But on Saturday, you really wanted a car to pick you up, you and your girlfriend up from dinner, and since you didn't take it the other 4 days, it's okay, right, to take it on Saturday? All right, this is a test. What's the answer? Very good. The answer is no. So we're taking 22, 23-year-old kids and having them go through, and there's obviously a lot of things. You know, I hear my partner saying something about putting extra time against a client's, should I stand up? And then we tell them the 10 or 12 ways they can report it without threatening their job, and that this is a good thing to do. And the funny thing is, what we find, if you look back in our forensic practice, finds it all the time. We have a practice that goes out and does these kind of investigations, is that everybody who ultimately gets involved in a big fraud started small. Because no one wakes up and says, I want to be a bad person. They find themselves getting closer to the line, and suddenly they look and the line's behind them, and they go, when did that happen? I bet Bernie Madoff didn't say, I've got a good idea. I'm going to start a scam. I bet it happened incrementally. And we say incrementally starts with the smallest thing, which is why we have our 10 steps in the articles to a model ethics and compliance program. You got to make it important. In our case, we have a retired federal judge who runs the program, who reports directly to the chairman, which says it's important. It must have stature. We have a code of conduct. Now, for people who are in ethics and compliance, they write the code of conduct in a language not so clear. And so one of our jobs as PR people were to take it and make it into 20 anecdotes with questions and answers. And we have a know the code, and we made it real and practical, made a huge difference. We win all these PR awards for it too, but it actually made a huge difference in what the program is. As I mentioned, the training, we talk about tone at the top. What we've also learned is the top for people is very different. You know, to me, the top is the chairman, Tim Flynn. Scary thought. For Steve, I'm the top. And actually, maybe even someone in between me is the top. And so when we say tone at the top, it has to go through everybody who has people reporting to it. We basically talk about relay stations and touch points. We say that every touch point you have with an employee, which includes when you recruit him, when you hire him, when you put him through orientation, any training, whether it's technical training or whatever, we build in ethics conversations and ethics training. And when you leave the firm, we do an interview to talk about ethics and compliance and what you saw. And we use all of that, and we actually feed it into a huge database so we can see trends and respond to them. And I mean, it sounds complicated, but it becomes part of the system. And the goal is to create an incredible business culture. I'm just going to conclude, and we're very proud of this program, and it is something that we counsel with our clients, etc. I'm going to close with like a little bit of optimism. We did a survey that I would describe of only C-suite executives, that is, people who are on the top floor of companies, and we did it in retail, technology, financial services, food and beverages, energy industries, and we asked them how do they feel about the economy. And here's the good news. 2/3 feel that conditions are in their own sector are worse than a year ago. 3/4 feel they will be better in 2010. And for the economy as a whole, about half think that 2010 will be the full recovery. 46% will believe it's 2011. All of us feel that we're in the right place. And so I would say what we're seeing is the general consensus on 2010 is economic metrics suggest recession has bottomed out. I will tell you what Nouriel Roubini says is don't think of it as a V in terms of a recovery. Think of it as a really elongated view. And truthfully, that's what our clients are telling us. And so what we're seeing as business and what our clients are telling us in terms of restoring your confidence, we see signs of optimism and feelings of caution, and maybe that's a good place to be. So I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Thank you, Kathleen. I think we all got some key indicators of what's necessary for restoring confidence. So our program is moving right along, and we have some questions for Kathleen. How does KPMG feel about dividing the finance firms into smaller businesses that are not too big to fail?
That's a question we're asked a lot about. In fact, actually, one of the things I wrote in the last 2 weeks, we think too big to fail is going to be the topic of all global regulation and all U.S. regulation. And what we're seeing happening in both the UK and the United States is that the regulators are asking the large conglomerates, like a Citibank, an AIG, to make a living will. And they're basically saying, you can stay as, because we still do need some large global companies, but we can't make them so systemic that if they fail, it's going to take us all down. So we're asking them to create a living will that says, if you're under pressure, in what order will you sell assets? Show us a reasonable plan that we believe will keep us, the whole system, protected. Now, it's before Congress now, by Barney Frank and another senator in the Senate. In the UK, it's passed as a law, and they're starting the trials with HSBC in the UK to have them put together a living will. What we think, let's face it, we serve a lot of these guys. So we think probably there is a need for large banks. But maybe the answer is that they are, which I'm going to get vertical and horizontal. You can have a very large bank, but if that becomes a bank and an investment bank and an insurance company, well, then it starts to become systemic. And so that's what has to be looked at, and that is what's being looked at in terms of regulation. And those are good conversations, and the kind of conversations we say we and our clients need to be a part of.
Sticking with regulation, do you find that increased regulation will cause a higher number of smaller businesses to be further challenged?
Okay, there's two ways. Interestingly enough, by and large, smaller businesses end up getting exempted from the first 2 or 3 years. I mean, quite frankly, smaller businesses only got affected by Sarbanes-Oxley, which was put into place in 2003, in around 2008. So they always wait for an amount of time where they've learned the lessons with the larger ones and they apply it in a way that they can do it. I think it ultimately, for the whole economy, it becomes too expensive for them not to be part of regulation. And that's what I think, it was the larger institutions that took us there. So I think that's where the focus is going to be. And I think eventually when they start to do smaller firms, it will be hopefully streamlined in a way that it works. I should also say one other thing is regulation and deregulation are cyclical. You go through periods of when you're regulated a lot and then you're deregulated. It's forever so. It doesn't matter, Republican, Democrat, or whatever. And that's going to continue. So we're in a cycle where regulation is going to take place, and the capital markets are going to be grateful because it's going to instill confidence. But it'll swing.
On the regulation side, do you think or don't you think that the rating agencies should be accountable for their systems?
I think clearly, I'm going to, when you work for an accounting firm, you basically always cite other people. But clearly in the UK, the rating agencies have taken a terrible hit, and there's all kinds of regulation going after them. And quite frankly, in our own Congress, they're looking at ways. Bottom line, it was the rating agencies that did give people AAA ratings that didn't deserve them. So they are all being looked at very seriously from a regulatory environment, and there's bills in front of Congress and already some rules being placed in the UK. So it's happening.
In some ways, we say that it's easy to be trustworthy and ethical in good times, and it's when the pedal hits the metal that it becomes a little more difficult. How do you think on your company or in business generally the various downsizings, mergers, and even disappearances have affected the quality and adequacy of the work by the remaining staff? What happens to the people that aren't fired, downsized, moved, or transferred?
I've lived through that in 3 companies, AT&T, Lucent, well, KPMG, you know, we sized ourselves to the market. And so as the market decreases, you know, we can decrease with staff, and it was not that dramatic. I think you have to size it to the market. You know, I think, you know, essentially, we don't seem to be in the mode of job creation. They're calling this the jobless recovery. And I think you're going to see the focus start to become, how do we create jobs? How do we focus people on green industries where we think that there is some value? The jobs that were supposed to come out of infrastructure still really haven't come out of infrastructure. You know, it's only been 10 months, so you have to see that. And I know the implicit part of the question is, gee, if all these people were eliminated, how do the people left do the same amount of work? The reality is there isn't the same amount of work. There aren't the same number of people buying certain things, so you don't need to make as many. There aren't as many people who are looking for discretionary services. For example, in a firm like ours, this isn't the time that they're saying, hey, look at our whole IT system. Good idea. They're delaying it. So, you know, people lay off generally because there isn't the work there. So there's usually a proportion.
How do we manage with encouraging people to invest if they don't understand the risks? Do we have a vehicle for education, if you will, so that the risks will be clear and evident and understandable, rather than curbing the development of new instruments that pose risk?
Well, I mean, I think that's a really good question. CNBC, when the stock market was going up, made CEOs seem like John Bon Jovi, and investment analysts seem like Dick Clark. I'm aging myself, saying, hey, look at this one, great tune, you can dance to it. That's just not the way people should invest anymore. And I think investor education is one of the big things that has to happen. And I think people do need to feel trust in that things are being regulated. I mean, the people who invested in Bernie Madoff were a relatively sophisticated group of investors who invested with someone they knew, that they knew from their temple.
And trusted. And
trusted. So you kind of go, whoof, how do you protect against that? Well, better regulation of broker-dealers. But the other thing is, I probably, as an investor, did not take advantage of all the upside that could have been taken place, because my father was a bus driver, my mother was a telephone operator. I'm calling this good. So I'm a conservative investor. But the real basic I know is, would you ever put your money all in one place? And that kind of basic investor education has to take place. In fact, one of the projects I was working on, the government was working on creating an investor education for the average person. And the funny thing is that they were basing it on 401ks. Of course, now today you're having people question 401ks when the stock market goes down. But there's no question you need real investor education, not just CNBC, you know, rock star type of investigation. Or I kind of enjoyed when Jon Stewart did the Jim Cramer thing, where he basically did all the predictions that Jim Cramer said and then what happened. I think people will become more savvy after something like this. And I do think real basic investor education has to take place. And I actually, and this isn't even a commercial for the sponsor of this symposium, I think Fidelity does a very good job. I think Fidelity and Vanguard do excellent jobs on their websites in terms of interacting, what the risks are, what your age is. I mean, there's some really good information on those websites that is actually easy to understand.
You heard it here first. Now, please thank Kathleen Fitzgerald for her